dislike of conflict and confrontation, if used properly, can serve them well. So the first quality that we can talk about here is their ability to be diplomatic. They can see things from both sides, and if they're using their tenderness, now we haven't talked much about that, it's worth putting that in here. Just as a melancholic has that sensitivity, the phlegmatic has their own equivalent attribute, which I call tenderness. And that's a real ability to kind of get in the other person's shoes, to empathize, to almost identify with what they're feeling. So if you've got two parties at war or in conflict with each other, and they have the ability, when they're using that tenderness constructively, to really engage.
Welcome to Grow Dreams podcast with me, your hostess, Shaylin Fair. Today is part 3 of 5 of the 4 Temperaments theory. It's an excerpt from a conversation I've had with John Sparks, who has been an author, counselor, and pastor for over 50 years. And he's used the 4 Temperaments theory to help the people he is helping, to help them understand themselves and to understand those they are in close relationship with. Last episode, we looked at the melancholic, which I am a big melancholic. I haven't got much of this temperament we're looking at today, which is the phlegmatic, which is the other introvert temperament. This temperament, I do have many experiences with phlegmatic, with stubborn phlegmatics who don't seem to use their stubbornness for good, but they dig their heels in for the wrong causes. You might know some people like that. They're not bad people at all, but they have this gift for being stubborn. And it depends on how they use that gift of stubbornness that makes all the difference in their relationships and in their own personal life. So you will hear about the weaknesses, the strengths, and different keys to understanding a phlegmatic person in your life, or if you yourself are very phlegmatic. Now, you can be 2 introvert temperaments. I don't have other phlegmatic traits, so I'm purely melancholic, but you do get people who are double introverts. So they'll have a lot of the melancholic and a lot of the phlegmatic. These are very special people. I've had some of these people in my life before, and they are a wealth of richness. So you will find out about the double introvert towards the end of this episode, after we unpack the phlegmatic. I hope you enjoy this episode. I'm doing these repeats of understanding temperaments because I find they are so helpful. There's so much good information in these conversations to do with how to have deep and close relationships with those people in your life. Because at the end of the day, life's quality really does come down to the quality and the depth of the relationships that we are having. And very often it's weaknesses in our temperaments or parts in ourselves that we don't understand that get in the way of us having deep, loving, meaningful relationships with those people in our lives. So it's once we understand our temperament, our strengths and weaknesses and things that can get in the way, then we're able to make a decision to remove those things, to make different choices so that we can connect deeply with our loved ones. So I hope you enjoy this episode. It has helped me grow, and I hope it will help you grow too.
Yes, very interesting temperament, and one that, again, can be very easily misunderstood. I want to try and give the feel of the phlegmatic here. We kind of talked about the melancholic as being like that circle that's alive all the time. But at the heart of the phlegmatic is this big question, am I substantial? Is there anything to me? It's quite difficult to find the right phrase to express this, but it's a kind of fear that there is nothing substantial to you. You're not solid enough. And if the wind blew strongly enough, you'd kind of get blown away. And by that, I mean emotionally. And that's a really important thing to hold on to as we go through all these attributes, because that drives so many of these characteristics. So, for example, the first thing we're going to say about them is that they can so readily be self-protective. But that makes sense, doesn't it? If you think of the fact that they feel unsubstantial, they're going to protect what they have got and not risk it being taken away from them. So relationships it's a dilemma, a paradox really. The phlegmatic, like any other human being, longs for meaningful relationships, but what they will tend to do is, as somebody approaches them, even to give love, there will always be that feeling of either they're not good enough, or this person, they may not think this, but this person is going to demand something of me, and I'm not sure if I can deliver. They've come to take from me. And the whole thing is sort of tipped in that direction. So they'll protect, they'll keep you out. And that can be really difficult. And this is where the understanding of the relationship between an extrovert and an introvert is very important. So let's put one of the extrovert temperaments that we'll come to in a while on top of that phlegmatic. So let's say we've got a sanguine phlegmatic. We'll see that a sanguine has just got a lovely personality. But inside, although the sanguine is reaching out, the phlegmatic is self-protecting and withdrawing. So with this person, you could feel, yeah, I can have a great relationship with them. They're lovely and enthusiastic. But, the truth be known, we can't get near to them at depth. And that would be your reason. The phlegmatic would be protecting themselves because that's their instinctive stance, really.
Just on that, John, when you say the phlegmatic is, protecting and, you can't get to that depth, can you give a practical example of that?
Well, as we touched on yesterday, in marriage relationships or even in friendships, it doesn't all have to apply to marriage. You perhaps see it at its starkest in marriage. You'll get perhaps the lovely sanguine melancholic wife, as we used the illustration yesterday, who will have married this lovely calm and collected man, and maybe he's got enough choleric that enables him to relate at a level to his wife, but she really wants his heart. She wants a deeper connection. And when she goes looking for it and asks for it, it feels like it's not there, but it actually is.
Do you mean share the phlegmatic not sharing their deeper thoughts and feelings on things?
Yes, and not able to pick up the melancholic's thoughts and feelings. You can hear the words. There's a million miles, isn't there, between hearing a statement from somebody and actually picking up the feel of what they're saying. It's somebody said to me once in a given situation, and she was tearful at the time, but she looked at me and she said, "You get it, don't you?" And that's what we're all looking for, somebody who gets it. It doesn't have to be in a lot of words. You just know that you've connected with the inner part of that person. And that's where it can go wrong, when there's the extrovert that is kind of acting as a substitute for what the phlegmatic should be doing. But anybody who's trying to draw close to that person will know that something big is missing here, and they're being denied what they entered into that relationship for.
Mm. And is there how would they self-protect? Would it be,
this is a very good question. Control is the key word. There's just certain places they won't go to. And, they will justify, they will defend, they will duck and weave. They'll give you all the right answers. You'll get a good logical explanation of a situation, but there's no heart in it. They're often good people. Some of them aren't very good. They can be horribly controlling. They can be, if we take this to an extreme, the kind of person who's very well thought of amongst the people out there, perhaps in the community or amongst a bunch of friends, and everybody says to the wife, "Oh, isn't he lovely? And you must be so pleased to have a man like that." And little do they know he's, a control freak at home, and she's really under pressure, and there's just the ability to control when they don't want somebody to get close. That's the point. You can afford to let Mrs. Jones down the road get close as up to a certain point because she won't demand anything of you emotionally. Why have a nasty habit of expecting something of you emotionally? So that becomes a threat. And so it's about control. Just another thing that's worth throwing in here, that self-protective instinct that we spoke about right at the beginning of the phlegmatic, it leads to taking the line of least resistance. So confrontation, anything really difficult emotionally, anything demands anything of the phlegmatic emotionally, he will feel or she will feel that to be a threat. And so you just protect. You just don't go there. What's the point of getting tangled up in that? It's the classic of where perhaps let's create a family situation here, and a daughter who's struggling with some issues phones in, or it might be a son even phones in. Dad picks up the phone. The son starts to pour out his trouble, and there's a good chance the phlegmatic dad will turn to the wife and say, "There's a call for you, dear," and expects his wife to step in. Because he's not chosen, perhaps during even his developmental years, and maybe he wasn't encouraged to. So now, as an adult, all that stuff is beyond him because he hasn't chosen to engage.
Yes, and actually, as a melancholic, I find that concept a little bit hard, because I kind of feel like I can always and quickly be emotionally engaged.
Yes.
So for someone to have, this, I guess, on-off switch, choosing what they're engaged with.
Yes.
It feels like a little bit of a, out there concept to me.
Yes. Again, there's an important point in there in what you're saying. Just as the melancholic is that ever alive circle, so the phlegmatic is also like a circle, but their circle is divided up into segments. And we can think of them as almost like at the edge of the circle, they have shutters. So you could have, let's say there's 30 shutters, 29 of them could be closed down. And if there's an area of life that they choose to engage with, they'll be wonderful and they'll pursue it. And there might not have been money to go on holiday that year, but if he suddenly gets it into his head he needs a new camera or a new computer or something like that, suddenly this money magically appears. It's because that's taken his interest. So he can, as an individual switch for each of the segments, he'll choose what he gets involved with. And there's also a master switch right at the center, whereas if he wants to completely close down, he can. I keep saying he, but you know that I include she in all of this because you can get phlegmatic ladies.
So then I guess it comes down to that person, being aware of that side of themselves and then actually choosing to engage even if they don't feel like it or if they want to switch off.
That's it. Love should cause us to go against those automatic, well-rehearsed instincts so that we choose to put the other person first and we reach through that barrier and life becomes completely different. If it's about us in our little world, it's a miserable place to be. Make it about the other person. I almost see it like a seesaw. I'm sure we have all done this as children. I remember playing in a park and sometimes somebody else would be on the other end of the seesaw and I'd stand up on one end, and especially if they were lighter than me, and then I'd start to walk towards the center. And you'd reach that certain point where the other person would go down at the other end of the seesaw. And the point of that illustration is it's when what the other person feels matters more to me than what I feel, that then things start to happen for the good. And it breaks that self-protective shield that we put around ourselves.
Yes. So let's chat a little bit more about the other negatives and then go into some of the positives with the phlegmatic.
Okay, they can be, because they feel unsubstantial, and I'll move through some of these quite quickly, they can feel very anxious. That can turn into developing a kind of checklist mentality that compensates for this general feeling of anxiety. They're trying to tie things down. They can be indecisive, and the reason for that is that we need that emotional side of who we are, the emotional life. We need our introvert to engage emotionally, whether it's with a person or a situation, so that we get the feel of that situation and can make a decision. So somebody might come to you and say, could you please help me with some advice here? Now, if we can get emotionally involved with that situation, get the feel of it, the phlegmatic is capable of giving good advice. But if they don't engage, it's just a mental level response, and it's often not worth very much, to be honest. So another trait is spectator. Because of everything that we've said about being self-protective, they become an observer. They look on. They'll be great at sitting in front of a television. A lot of good children, inverted commas there, because they're quiet. They're not often the noisy one in the family. Easy for mum or dad to plonk them in front of the telly, because they'll watch Thomas the Tank Engine 28 times all the way through, and because they're observing. It doesn't require anything of them, but it doesn't do them any good. They will procrastinate. Again, it's that theme of the line of least resistance. So, why put yourself through the emotional challenge of having to do something today if it could possibly be done tomorrow? And there's always the chance that tomorrow may never come, or it might not need doing by tomorrow. So let's take that chance and not bother with it today. They can be fearful. A lot of the phobias, and I certainly can't say all, but you will often find the phlegmatic experiencing many of the phobias that trouble people. It isn't that the melancholic doesn't have their own version of fear, but that feeling of being unsubstantial can really create a pressure within the phlegmatic. They have their version of being selfish, and it links in with the self-protection. So they'll protect what they've got, and they can be mean with what they've got. Now, if they like you, or if they believe in your cause, in fairness to them, they can also be very generous. But it's what they select. So it can often be quite minimalistic, and that's part of the self-protection. They can be very lazy, and I do say can be because we're also going to see in a moment they can be very hardworking. It's what they choose to be. This line of least resistance again. Why bother to tidy your room today? It's not too bad. It's live-inable. And then when it gets really, really bad, then you have a big splurge and tidy it up, and then you determine you're not going to let it get like that again, but you do. Until it gets really bad again. Instead of choosing to engage all the time, consistently, and to be on top of things. And that links in with being unmotivated. Again, why bother? Now, if a phlegmatic does have a conviction, and by that I mean if there's something they really believe in, and they really latch on to that, they can be very good. And as we'll see in a moment, they can make very good leaders. And they're very motivated and very solid people. But if they choose not to engage, then you won't get the best out of them. And that's, before we move to the positives, that's a key thing, that a phlegmatic can be one thing or the other, chalk or cheese. It's down to their decision. They could grow up as adults loving books, absorbing them, or never reading a book from one end to the other, and for their adult life. It depends what they choose to do. and it lies within their power. They can be dull and grey, or they can be colourful and positive. They've got the power of choice. I know we all have, but that's particularly applicable for the phlegmatic.
So shall we go on to some positives for the phlegmatic?
I think we'd better. that dislike of conflict and confrontation, if used properly, can serve them well. So the first quality that we can talk about here is their ability to be diplomatic. They can see things from both sides. And if they're using their tenderness, now we haven't talked much about that, and it's worth putting that in here. Just as a melancholic has that sensitivity, the phlegmatic has their own equivalent attribute, which I call tenderness. And that's a real ability to kind of get in the other person's shoes, to empathize, to almost identify with what they're feeling. So if you've got two parties at war or in conflict with each other, and they have the ability, when they're using that tenderness constructively, to really engage with both parties without favor, to see it from both sides and to hopefully bring those two parties together. So you can immediately see that they can use who they are extremely positively, or if they don't reach through that feeling of being unsubstantial, instead of drawing parties together, they become a source of conflict themselves because they defend and protect themselves, and that breaks relationships. And as we touched on a moment ago, they can be a very good leader. Once they have a clear sense of what's right and what's wrong and what's worth fighting for, then they will go for it. And because they're solid, they plod, and they're stable, then, they make very good leaders. And equally, they can be very easygoing and laid back, as we said. That's a wonderful quality, to be able to keep your head when all around are losing theirs. It's that proper use of that laid backness and objectivity, but you still have to stay engaged. It can't be a switched off easygoingness. They can be very efficient, and I'm using that as almost an equivalent to the melancholic organized. For example, a lot of bankers and accountants and people like that used to be phlegmatic. Some still are, especially accountancy. That's not obviously exclusively so, but they like things in columns, well organized, and they have their own version of organization. So again, that's an engaged and secure phlegmatic. They can be very practical. And again, this is the chalk and cheese thing. Phlegmatic can shy away from DIY, for example, and never engage, and then protect themselves from it. Or if they choose to learn, they can be very, very good. They can be humorous. It's often a dry, observational type of humor. But if they're using that tenderness that we talked about to really engage, they can feel what the other person's feeling, so it doesn't have to be unkind humor. And they can bring a lot of fun into a situation. As we've said already, they can be very dependable and very calm. And I've also used the word conservative with a small c, because although there is a place for being expansive and generous and so on, you often need somebody who will just be cautious. I've got a good friend in business who says every business needs a phlegmatic accountant. It would be for that reason, that they will think the thing through and not act foolishly, hopefully, when it comes to the way that they use the resources. So that's quite a description of the phlegmatic.
That is a very lovely description. I'm wondering as well, just with the same, as I asked for the melancholic, a few keys to remember or to think about if you find, a lot of these character traits?
Yes, these are things really more to bear in mind when either if you're phlegmatic yourself or you're working with or, love somebody who also has this temperament. So the first things to bear in mind, feels fragile, so they will protect themselves. If you kind of hold that in mind, for example, when you're engaging in conversation, you might think, oh, this person's being awkward. And yeah, they probably are, but they're probably scared. And they may not admit that. You're probably not likely to blurt out, well, what you're scared about. But actually, there will be a way of reaching that person's heart. Now, they won't always let you, but remember they're protecting themselves because they're fearful of what they're lacking. Whether they lack it or not, they probably don't. It's what they fear about themselves. So remember that, and that leads to taking the line of least resistance. And that will be in all the ways that we talked about, whether it's procrastination, indecisive, and all the rest. And in a way, for the phlegmatic, that power of choice that we touched on, that's a key here. You can make excuses forever for yourself if you're a phlegmatic or for somebody else. But there comes a point where that little thing is very true. Just do it. Just do it. And when you do it, you feel better. You've broken through your own internal barrier. So, don't stay taking the line of least resistance. Get involved. Don't stand on the edge. Deliberately engage in the conversation. Deliberately become part of working out a solution and not just the silent person who lets everybody else get on with it. So don't stand on the edge. We touched on the fact that when a phlegmatic gets a strong conviction about something, they can make a great leader. They can also use that attribute to be very stubborn. Well, being stubborn's all right if you're not digging your heels in over doing what's right. If you see what I mean. If you're doing wrong and somebody's trying to get you to do what's right, being stubborn's not a good thing. But if you choose to do what's right, be stubborn about doing right. And that's where that sort of inner strength that is there inherently is put to good use. Be stubborn for doing good and stick with it and make a difference in this big world.
So helpful. I am wondering, I know we've gone a little bit over the usual time of these episodes, but this is just so useful. And to kind of bring this into landing, I'm wondering what happens when someone's listening to this and they say, I'm both of these. I know for me, when I hear about the phlegmatic, the majority of what you said, I just can't relate that much to, So I know that I'm very much of the melancholic introvert. Yes. What if somebody can relate to both and all qualities?
Yes. It's just very possible, even likely, that you are a double introvert. In other words, you have got both introvert temperaments. And when we do look at the extrovert temperaments, you may not recognize either of them because you don't have to have an extrovert temperament. So there's a good possibility. It's also possible, going back to the illustration of the floor puzzle, when you take a kind of cursory glance at the pieces all lying there mixed up on the floor of these four different pictures, or that when you put the pieces together, they will form four different pictures. A lot of those pictures look similar. So, for example, the sort of negativity of the melancholic could easily be mistaken, say, for the anxiety of the phlegmatic. The tenderness of the phlegmatic could be mistaken for the sensitivity of the melancholic, and so on. It will feel like there's an overlap, but they're two very different creatures, if I can put it like that, and it's important to recognize that they are. But yes, you may well be a double introvert, and that's absolutely, in fact, that's a wonderful temperament mix to have.
Is it wonderful? Because then you've got all the problems of the negatives of the melancholic and then the phlegmatic as well. How do you've got, where would a double introvert start? What would their question be? Because if they're both very feeling and then as well able to switch off.
Yes. Yes. Well, an interesting thing here, I kind of tend to see these temperaments quite visually in my mind. And so, for example, a double introvert, I would see a square with the melancholic at the bottom, if you like. That's not to make any comment about, value. But sitting on top is the phlegmatic. And so the phlegmatic takes on the role of extrovert, or tries to. So the phlegmatic is, as we said earlier on, a bit of a chameleon and can act like a choleric, say in a work situation, or like a sanguine in a leisure situation. The trouble is they're aware that they don't make as good a job of it as somebody who is actually a choleric or somebody who is a sanguine. So they do end up feeling they're just not quite good enough. And that can produce a real struggle. I know a number of people that have that temperament mix. I happen to marry one. One of my sons happened to have that mix. And so I've, for example, with my son, I've said, you have a double whammy of absolute quality. And it's getting the person to accept that anything that they feel they might be missing out on by not having an extrovert, they more than make up for by having that incredible mix of the two introvert temperaments. And there's a richness and there's a depth. A lot of people with extrovert and introvert spend half their lives trying to make sure that they're living in their introvert or else avoiding it. And there's that battle between extrovert and introvert. Whereas for a double introvert, well, at least they're living in an introvert all the time. The real challenge for the double introvert is to live in both those temperaments, because, as we said, the phlegmatic can act as an extrovert and end up protecting the melancholic with all its sensitivity from the costly relationships that are around them. And especially with that feeling of not being quite good enough. So the phlegmatic can be like a big buffer and can exercise control and prevent the melancholic from giving proper expression to himself or herself, and can prevent somebody from really reaching the melancholic. But if that double introvert's been brought up in a secure environment, you get an amazing double whammy of just sheer goodness.
Wow, John, thank you so much for those wonderful insights into the two introvert temperaments. I hope you enjoyed that episode of Grow Your Dreams podcast. You can go over to YouTube and watch this episode. You can also listen in on all podcast platforms. You can also head over to Instagram at Grow Your Dreams podcast. Send me a message there and let me know how you are enjoying this series. Your feedback is very welcome, and I do love to get encouragement from listeners as well. That's why I'm doing this to encourage others and provide helpful insights so we can have flourishing lives.